This is Vital Signs, a podcast on cutting-edge trends in health tech and the people shaping them. And today we have a really exciting guest, Thomas Swalla, joining us from Dotmatics, where he is the CEO. Thomas has had a variety of really interesting tech leadership roles before coming into healthcare and life sciences at Dotmatics. And Dotmatics is an R&D software company I'm sure most of our listeners are familiar with. It's used by over 2 million scientists and 10,000 customers, and has a really interesting history of how the company kind of came together, which I'm sure we'll get into today. So Thomas, thanks so much for coming on.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Well, I mean, to start, I'd just be curious. You've kind of run companies throughout tech. How did you kind of come to healthcare in the first place? And maybe also a good chance to kind of explain to our listeners the history of Dotmatics, because obviously a very interesting company.
Well, Jacob, I think came to healthcare kind of at the beginning of 2018. And so I was running an education software business, and we had just sold our business to a public company and started to think about maybe the next things to do. But ultimately, having done this will be my 7th software business since the late 90s that I've been involved with, either been the founder of, an early employee of, or an operator of. And so software is all I've ever done. It's what's most interesting to me. And coming off of that transaction, which took place at the end of 2017, looking for the next thing to do, I got introduced to some folks at Insight Partners. And while I had never had Insight Partners as an investor in any of my previous businesses, I always had tremendous respect for them. And they had just acquired a business called GraphPad Prism. And for those folks that don't know, Prism is a software application used by life scientists that really has broad use cases and applicability, that is really a statistical analysis and visualization tool. And so they were talking with me about the thesis about creating a company around life sciences and software. And it was really, really interesting. I mean, ultimately, what you think about is, how do you want to go to work every day with really smart people to solve really hard problems that hopefully has an impact on the world? So this checked all those boxes. The one box it didn't check, just to be clear, is I'm not a life scientist. I don't have a PhD in chemistry or biology. And so the subject matter upon which our company operates today is very, very complex. And while, I think I'm not probably the dumbest person in the room usually, I don't stand a chance with most of our employees and our customers with the knowledge that they have. And we can talk about that because I think it's a big theme in the industry. I think it's a lot of the challenges that we have in our industry are just around the true complexity of life sciences, and in particular drug discovery, and all of the areas that are involved. But over time, I talked to Insight, and they shared with me the thesis. And the thesis was, there hadn't been a large-scaled software-only business that existed in the R&D ecosystem. And so while you saw kind of in the early 2000s, mid 2000s, digital transformation taking across all of these different industries, when you looked at life sciences in particular, there wasn't a big software business that existed. And you had seen Veeva kind of exist in the clinical trial space, but nothing existed at scale in the R&D space. So that was the thesis, is we think there's an opportunity to go do that. And if you dug one level deeper, you kind of understood one of the reasons why. And up until that point, anytime a software business kind of in the lab ecosystem started to get to scale, a lot of times what you would see is these large instrument businesses, instruments, consumables, reagent businesses that live in that ecosystem would acquire the software business that was closest to the data coming off the instrument and going into the software. But by no fault of theirs, at the end of the day, they're normally instrument companies and they're hardware companies, and they don't have a place to run a software business, right? And so they put the software company really close to the instrument P&L, and ultimately they think about bundling it. And then a lot of times they go, oh, well, we want this to work really well with our instruments, but not our competitors' instruments. And by default and by nature, right, that's not what customers want. And so what you would see is a lot of acquisitions happening, and we can talk about it, but there is this really fragmented ecosystem inside R&D. The number of companies, the niches that exist are very, very deep. And so nobody had done that. And so that was the thesis. How do we create a large-scaled, software-only, instrument-agnostic business? And we started with GraphPad, was the first acquisition that we made at the very end of 2017. And we can talk about it rolling forward today. We've actually made now 11 acquisitions over the past 5.5 years. and plan to continue to make more over the next several years as well.
Oh, we'll definitely get into it. But before we do that, as the resident dumbest person in the room currently, and as someone who obviously you made the transition into life sciences, so you clearly learned this from scratch, can you just tell me like a little bit about what are the actual steps in the R&D process today? And then where does like Dotmatics sort of slot itself in to that equation?
Yeah, certainly. So let's talk about, so there are these big sectors, and life sciences, one of the end markets is drug discovery, but there are other end markets around new materials, food and beverage, agriculture. But with life science, and by the way, we participate in all of those and we think about all of those in a very similar way. But I think within drug discovery and in R&D, you're at the very early stages. It's the innovation engine, right? Scientists are the innovation engine of the world. At least I believe that today. Now I believe it even stronger today, being the CEO of Dotmatics than I ever have before. But you're in the early stages of creativity, asking questions and trying to design new molecules and new therapies to solve some disease state or some other applicability or problem that exists out there. Now, I will say there is this transition happening, and like I said, we'll continue to talk about it, but it used to be all about bench science, and it used to be all about science data. And those things used to be manageable, and people used to write in notebooks, right? They were lab notebooks, and they used to write their experiments down. And over the past 20 years, obviously, things have transitioned, whereas you start to look at where we are today, but more importantly, where we're heading, it's as much about data science as it ever was science data. But it actually does take the harmonization of those two things. And it's one of the biggest challenges that exists is actually how do you harmonize it, not just from a technology perspective, but a people perspective as well. Being able to harmonize science data and data science together in a way where everybody is rowing in the right direction with the exact same objective functions that they're optimizing for. It's a real challenge. By the way, it's hard at our company, and we can talk about some of those challenges. And it's one that I exist. Like I said, if people come up and they want to talk to me about flow cytometry, I sort of understand it. I'm a curious person. I read a lot. I watch a lot of videos. But at the end of the day, you have people that have dedicated their entire lives to one, what we would call swim lane within R&D, right? And there are hundreds of swim lanes within R&D. And by the way, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of software providers that participate in those swim lanes. And so that is the challenge, the complexity, also the opportunity. And when you look at, and we'll talk about some of the things that are happening with AI and ML, that is the opportunity that exists kind of going forward.
Yeah. So can you tell us a little bit about like what Dotmatics actually does? So you're the software, you're agnostic to all the instruments that are coming out. I assume there's some data harmonization that's happening from the data streams coming out of there, but like what does Dotmatics actually do? And also I'm just curious like how you got like these hardware companies to play ball or with your platform, or if they even do, or you like figured out a janky way to basically work with all of them.
Yeah, great question. So I think about it a little differently. So we have 9 products today, right? So Dotmatics, and those products all came via acquisition, right? So we acquired different products that live in different swim lanes. And today, just to be clear, while we own 9 products and we're developing some other products, it's still just scratching the surface of all of the software that exists, right? And so when you think about it today, and I'll talk a little bit about a GraphPad Prism, which I mentioned is kind of a statistical analysis and graphing tool. We have bioinformatics tools. So there's a product called SnapGene, which does molecular biology procedures around cloning. How do you plan, develop, and actually execute cloning procedures? That's around bioinformatics. We also have Genius, which does sequencing and alignment. We also have 2 flow cytometry products that I mentioned. And flow cytometry is an area of science where you put fluid, a lot of time blood through it, and you stain cells. And so we have 2 flow cytometry products. We have one product called Protein Metrics, which is a protein characterization or a proteomics product as well. And then we have what you would consider to be more, I think, enterprise software businesses, in that the ones that I just previously mentioned just now are more applications, right? Think of them as tools that end user scientists use. Think of Excel and PowerPoint and Word, if you will, right? And then you have enterprise tools, which tie those together. And we have 2 enterprise tools. One is called our Dotmatics platform, which talks to enterprises, and the other one is Lab Archives, which talks to academics. And those tools are what ties those things together. And Nikhil, to your point, data comes off of these instruments, right? And so you're able to read these data in these instruments as well. And sometimes there's standards, sometimes there's not standards. But all of the companies, regardless of if they have our software or other software, has to be able to get those data, has to be able to get those files. But actually, what you just mentioned is probably the biggest challenge today is the data harmonization and the data management tools that are needed to actually take place to enable all the things that this industry wants to do going forward, including us, including our customers. Because previously, over the past 20 years, you were able to handle the data that would come off these instruments, right? They would be in CSV files, and instrument makers had done a tremendous job actually creating better instruments. And so, but the data tsunami that is taking place in our ecosystem is absolutely astounding. And you just get petabytes and petabytes of data coming out of instruments. And now you're testing materials. And then you have phenotypic and genotypic information that needs to be correlated together. That is where we're all falling down, I think, as an industry today. While science has actually made tremendous strides, the infrastructure to support it and to actually get insights and ask the right questions the right way has been lagging. And it gets back to that. One of the biggest challenges is in every other industry, if you go hire folks that are awesome at machine learning, awesome at data scientists, they're great engineers, and you say, hey, we're going to point you at insurance or financial services. I think probably the three of us here understand now what it means to actually what a loan is. What dollars and cents mean. Like, you have conceptual awareness.
I don't know if you've seen the out-of-pocket financials, but it's unclear if all of us fully do. But yes, certainly.
That's right. That's exactly.
We don't use dollar cents.
but you get it, right? Like, you at least get it. And unfortunately, that is not the case. You take the smartest folks, you throw them in life sciences, and they look at all this data, and it's like, no context, no awareness, no understanding of even what it is. And by the way, you don't get that overnight, because these people that understand it well, it's their entire life's work, right? And so the complexity of it is just astounding. And you need both folks, right? You need these people that both understand data management, data sciences, but have that scientific awareness. And that's a real challenge. And by the way, if you look at our company today, we have hundreds of PhDs at our company, but the so few are the people that truly understand other people's area of science. It's one of the reasons why there hasn't been a large-scale software company, is because you need to understand all of these different areas.
There's so many different threads I feel like I want to pull on here, but maybe just for that last point, because I think you kind of have alluded to this a few times. Like, there's hundreds of different swim lanes within within kind of broader life sciences, and someone could spend most of their career really specializing in a particular area, a particular kind of therapeutic modality or way of running experiments. Like, obviously I meet a lot of companies in the space, and one question we always have is like, how similar are the needs across different modalities, biologics for small molecules, or how common are the needs across, a brand new biotech and a kind of at scale pharma company versus, how bespoke are they to the very specific way that company does science? I'm sure you think about this all the time.
Yeah, I think about it all the time. It's a great question. I think the way that we think about it is there are certainly commonalities between the modalities that exist, whether you said small molecule or large molecule. And if you think about those modalities, those flow cytometry is used everywhere. GraphPad Prism is used everywhere, right? So there are these areas of science that are abstracted away that are used everywhere. Analytics is everywhere. Data management is everywhere, right? Understanding lakehouse technology is everywhere. But within each area, there are bespoke products and workflows and tools that specialize just in those workflows for those types of data with those scientists. So they are both. There's an abstraction layer across, but there is definitely bespoke tools that exist everywhere. And Jacob, I think that's part of the reason why, as an investor, right, as a venture investor, it's really hard to look at any of these swim lanes and think about the TAM and go, wow, that TAM is big enough to actually have a venture investment in. That doesn't exist. And part of the reason why then is what you see in the businesses that we've acquired. Almost every single one of the businesses we acquired were built by scientists. They normally were built by their own use case. A lot of them came out of academia. They know it so well that they had to build it for themselves, which is why they fixate on how many pixels are in a workflow when they do the clicking, because they themselves have to deal with plasmid files, for instance, right? And if you deal with plasmid files, you understand what that is. And so it is by scientists, for scientists. Those are the places that have existed. And then you do have places that are a little more horizontal in nature, right? There is this, where just broad compute power, data management, analytics, those are things that can get abstracted away. And those are things where you actually see investment today. But when you peel those layers back, you need to have expertise in that area of science that your software is dedicated to. And it's, by the way, it is the reason why there hasn't been a large-scale software business, because if you know cloning really, really well, you probably don't know liquid chromatography pretty well, right? And those are two very distinct areas, but both are incredibly needed in order to bring drugs to market. And one of the things that we look at and we try to do is, in order to keep innovating, right, you need to have empathy and understanding of your customer problem. And so we try really hard to mirror our customers. And so we have scientists, because of the acquisitions in our inorganic growth, that understand these range of scientific swim lanes and modalities. And so we do mirror our clients in that sense. Jacob, to your point, you were asking about large pharma versus biotech. Obviously, a lot of the challenges they face are very similar, and that science is complex. The small biotechs that just got started, though, they don't have the legacy systems, the legacy data, things sitting on mainframes, tapes, experiments. They can be built from day one with this more data management and data science pack, right? So that gives them an ability to move quicker. That gives them an ability from day one to be able to manage data better. But what that doesn't give them an ability is, it doesn't give them an ability to live and innovate off of 30 or 40 or 50 or 60 years of knowledge and experimentation. Because at the end of the day, all of these companies today, they are competitive with each other. They have their own moats. Their moats are around their specific IP that they built over several years doing the experiments that they've had, right? And you need to understand those experiments and know how to harvest that data from those experiments, because that is the moat, right? And even in the world that we're moving into in the AI and ML, there's a lot of commoditization that will take place. And sure, software vendors will provide tools that will allow you to look through every compound that ever existed because they were published in all these papers. But guess what? If that data is open to the public, everybody will be using it, and therefore you're back in this world of commoditization. And so the only way you create moats as a drug company is to live off of those proprietary data and those proprietary experiments that you live with on. But that means you have to be able to capture it, right? And if you still look at the way work is done today, I mean, you could argue, many have, that drug discovery is a function of Excel. If you look at what ends up happening today, that is still where a lot of work takes place. And by the way, when you're doing things in Excel files, guess what that does? Nobody captures that. The enterprise doesn't own that. They don't even know what the scientists did, right? And so you have to be able to capture all of that data and the work that they're doing to be able to understand that.
Totally.
And then you have to do it across these thousands of swim lanes, right? Which is part of the problem. And then, oh, by the way, you've got to have people in your organization that understand both real data management at scale, high compute power at scale, and scientific complexity. And I tell this story all the time. I'll share it here because I still think it's just fascinating to me. The digital transformation that took place in insurance, financial services, manufacturing, and logistics. When I got here in 2018, I decided to call a few customers. And so I called a few customers and I talked about the cloud. And the first 2 phone calls I made, they said, well, the cloud is a fad. And I thought, wait, the cloud is a fad? It's 2018. Like, how could we be talking about the cloud? I mean, if we may have had that argument back in 2002, 3, and 4, but they believed it. They believed it was a fad, right? And so I think that there are so many kind of legacy things that have taken place, and also the regulatory framework that exists with the FDA and others that has just we're just earlier on in that digital transformation journey,
Totally.
combined with the complexity of exist. But it is, if there was ever an industry built for cloud, high compute, AI and ML, driving it, this is it. I mean, I don't know of another place that you could actually point your guns at, right? And actually make it work.
So, I mean, to this point of like, all the different swim lanes out there, I feel like every industry we look at seems to go through these phases of like bundling and unbundling, right? Where like, at times people say, hey, I want, even if I'll make trade-offs in the efficacy of an individual tool, it's better to have it all under one roof versus like, hey, I want a best in breed tool. And it feels like we go through cycles in industries. I'm curious, like, where the arrow is headed right now in life sciences. Like, do you think we're going toward bundling, toward unbundling? Like, what are you seeing on the front lines?
Yeah, I just think you can't get away from best in breed because ultimately you have to leave it up to the scientists that are experts to pick the tools that they want to do their work, right? But that doesn't mean the real challenge here is the data flows, right? So let people do their work in Genius. Let them do their work in protein metrics. However, there needs to be bi-directional data flows that take and harmonize all that data. So think of it as interoperability. But I think you're still at this best of breed because those scientists that are doing their job, you need to let them pick their tool, right? And they are the experts. And so there very few enterprises, I think it just wouldn't make sense. And by the way, some of them have tried to kind of push down on people the type of software that they need to use, but I just don't think that's the right path, right? And so the path today is around interoperability and the data flows out of these systems. And I think one of the biggest challenges has been because there's so much fragmentation for a lot of companies, it doesn't make financial sense, and it's not what their business is. They're not working towards interoperability because that doesn't actually help drive their business. And so you end up in this boat where you need you need enough scale internally at a company, or you need to have enough impact at a company to be able to own enough of the products to be able to do this yourselves, which is what we're trying to do. Now, by the way, we're a long ways from it, but that is the thesis. Like, we own enough things that are interesting enough at our customers that we can make this work, right? And we don't have to rely on partners or other people that need to get in the way of their business objectives. Like, these are our objectives, totally. Right? Now, we still have the challenges of getting all of our product teams aligned around that, right? And around those things. But that's okay, right? We can do that work. But I think you're right. That bundling and unbundling, I just think we just need bi-directional data flows that get harmonized and structured the right way. I think though the biggest challenge still for us is, or the ecosystem, is a lot of the instrument companies. I'm not sure that they believe in the open ecosystem. Ultimately, when you have instruments, you have your own files, you want to lock people into your ecosystem. But when you walk into any lab, they have instruments from everybody, right? It's not like you're a Thermo Fisher lab, a Danaher lab, an Agilent lab, right? And so it is inevitable that these tools will exist everywhere. So you do need the data flows, right? You have to make that work.
It's funny. I feel like a lot of healthcare investors leave traditional health tech for life sciences to escape these things, but like everything you said certainly resonates.
I'm literally listening to this. I'm like, oh my God, it's everywhere.
But it is everywhere, right? But like I said, biology is the problem here, and it's the opportunity. It's just complex, and we don't even know much about it, right? So you're still learning every day and how to get better here, right? So.
And I mean, you've obviously mentioned, like, I feel like there's unprecedented amounts of data being generated in these R&D efforts today. And, even in the recent, in the last year or two, you've seen some of the, like, kind of general horizontal, like, big data players like AWS, Snowflake, kind of come into life sciences in a big way. I'm sure your customers use some of these services. I'm sure you fill in some of the gaps. But I think our listeners would find it super interesting, like, to what extent does life sciences require like its own vertical specific data tools, and to what extent is just AWS Snowflake good enough for life sciences?
Yeah, I think what we think about is those use cases that are very specific, where high compute and large storage, and you can apply analytics on top of one specific use case. That is where I think horizontal players can play today, right? And so, genomics or sequencing, or, maybe in flow cytometry, one specific use case where you can actually, the leverage of storing data and computing and then analyzing on top works really, really well. Where that falls down, I think, for the horizontal players or the infrastructure guys is, again, that's just like one piece of a 10,000 piece puzzle, right? And so they can provide that one piece well, but who's going to do all that other work? Like, where are all the other scientists that can bring all the other data together that understand what that looks like? That's the area where you have to do that in order to drive efficiency in the drug development process. So that's right. Our people use those tools. By the way, we ourselves use those tools. I would probably throw Databricks in there as well, because we're starting to see Databricks really obviously in kind of built for AI and ML have a lot of traction in the life sciences space. So it exists for horizontal folks. I don't think they probably, up to them, I guess, if Microsoft or Amazon wants to get into the vertical, but it's impossible to actually solve the vertical challenge without being a hard sciences PhD driven business. It just is impossible, because you just don't understand the context and the awareness of what that data is, right? And so you see people like, Incitro and Recursion and Accenture that are really good examples of this. I think, but one of the things that the macro climate has done is building drug companies is incredibly capital intensive, right? And so as the cost of capital has continued to rise and you think about efficiency, it's really hard as an investor probably to continue to make those capital requirements that it takes to build biotechs from scratch. It's very, very expensive. And so as you start to see that happen, you just have to be so focused on what that use case is you're solving for. It's, by the way, why we've chosen to be an enabler, right? We're empowering our scientists to solve the problems with software, just because we believe so much in operating these software businesses.
So maybe just like branching off of that for a second. I'm curious, where do you actually incorporate AI ML into your tools today, if you do? And then related to that, is the sell of the AI incorporation hey, we will make make it more efficient for you to find targets that we think are going to go through the entire pipeline? Is it that we're going to speed up your processes where they are today? I'm just curious, where's the efficiency actually coming? Or is it more hey, we're going to charge a premium for this because we think it'll be easier to identify X, Y, and Z thing?
Yeah, so I think the right answer is it will be absolutely everywhere, right? So in our specific tools that we have, and I can talk about one today that we're using machine learning in those swim lanes, in those very niche use cases, there is AI that will be applied on them. And I'll give you one example today that we're working on with companies, and it is around the flow cytometry use case. And in flow cytometry, when you run blood through a flow cytometer, you end up with these clumps of cells. And there's a process called gating. And by the way, I hope I'm doing justice. I'm sure the PhDs in our company are going to go, oh my gosh, I can't believe Thomas tried to explain all this. There's a process called gating where actually individuals try to identify clumps of cells that might express a certain way. And they literally draw gates around those clumps of cells. And it's a very subjective process. It's a manual process today. It's completely outsourced. But that is one example where we have models today that you can take flow cytometry data and do what's called automated gating. And what that does is obviously it speeds up the time. It reduces, if you're developing a CAR T therapy and you have very sick cancer patients and you're trying to produce these batches to be infused back into a patient, you run them through flow cytometers and you understand the right sample to give them and do the CAR receptors work correctly. That's an example of today, there's manual processes involved in that. It takes time. It can be wrong. You can snap your fingers and do that today with more predictability, quicker. You can actually push the analysis instantly to the second it comes out of the machine. And therefore, you can get the drugs to the patients that are very sick sooner. And oh, by the way, these individual batches of CAR receptors that gets put back into patients, it's $300,000 plus for one treatment. And there are many times today where a subjectivity of an individual person will go, you know what? That treatment isn't good. And that's $300,000 wasted. And with automated gating and with AI and ML, that can happen. So that's one example. We're doing it today. We're working with customers, but every one of the products has that, Nikhil. I think the bigger issue, and by the way, I can ramble off a few areas, right, between target identification and molecular simulations and synthesis pathway generation. There are so many areas where AI will be driven on top of this. I think one of the biggest challenges, though, isn't within those individual areas, because those individual areas will indeed bring down the efficiency and help everywhere. But it's in trying to get all of the areas together in a correlated structure and put a model on top of that. So yes, we can understand compounds quicker, we can identify targets quicker, but can we take all of the data across all of these areas and correlate it together and put models on top of it to start learning? That is actually when you start to think about driving billions of dollars to millions of dollars. That's the big challenge. That's the challenge that we're today pretty far away from, quite frankly. But it's the challenge that everybody is trying to solve, right? And it really is a data challenge. So this one is less of a science challenge, and it is a data challenge. But AI will be everywhere. Every part of the chain and efficiency will be driven. We're seeing it today because you can have models applied on top of all of these things within your particular area. Today, just to be clear, and you might know better than I do, we don't own a digital pathology business. We don't own an image analysis business, but it's an area that we look at all the time. But it exists, right? And I think we're at this kind of point where we've proven it enough, but it's still an augmentation tool, right? Today, all of the AI helps augment the scientists, the radiologists, and the folks. And even with where we're headed with AI, once we solve, and by the way, I think as an industry, we will solve it. I don't know if Dotmatics will solve it. I hope we are a part of that solution, but people will solve this problem. Once we can solve the data challenges, you end up in this world where today we've kind of got foundational software in place. So if you're thinking about the digital transformation journey, we've got foundation done. We're using software. That didn't exist, by the way, 20 years ago, right? So using software, things are digitized. Now we're kind of at this transformational point where it's all about trying to harmonize and structure the data that comes out of all these systems. And then we move to what is aspirational, and that aspirational today is predictive, right? We need to get predictive, which just helps drop that equation. But ultimately, after predictive, you want to get prescriptive, right? Like you do want self-driving drug discovery, right? You do want recursive innovation. And I think what we've seen with Auto GPT, we know that that's possible. But again, if you don't have the foundation of the data that you trust, that's reusable, that is really hard to manage today, you can't get there. You just can't get there, right? And you bring in all the instrument data, you bring in all the sequencing data, you bring in all the testing of the materials data, you got to get there. You got to get there. And I think that is the problem that everybody is aligned at today. And I think if you think about startups and the ecosystem that we see today, that is probably the area where we actually see the most innovation, and rightfully so, right? Rightfully so, as you can help companies manage in a cost-efficient manner, in a software manner. And the reason why I say that is because today there are service providers that are trying to solve this problem for companies, right? And if you think about life sciences and the ecosystem today and this problem I mentioned, you could easily argue that Accenture is probably the folks that have the best business model around it, right? But those are services businesses, and we believe that software today, while it's not software, it is softwareable. That problem is softwareable, and that's where I think that the innovation is happening across the ecosystem today. There's one nuanced thing that I would like to point out that I think is important, though, is in order to try, we think, and I think others do too, is that in order to make that happen, you need kind of that infrastructure layer to disappear to the scientists. And you need to push the work that is able, like, who should be correlating the data, structuring the data, defining the relationships between the data? It should be scientists, because they know how to do that. Today, it's not scientists. It's IT. It's in the CIO. It's DBAs, they're writing transforms. Like, that's really hard when they have no context for the data that they're doing that with. And so we have to figure out ways to push that work to the scientists and give them that power. And that is a challenge today with the technology that exists, because it's not the way that the tech world works right now.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting, right? You were mentioning this earlier about how you need basically two very different types of expertise to be able to communicate with each other, right? Like the data science folks, and then the people who are much more familiar with life sciences. In theory, actually, if the tools become AI enabled, and you actually don't need to transmit the expertise of like the data science side, for example, then you have less of this like telephone game around like, oh, the research team has to communicate to the data science team around how they actually have to think about experiment design or data that comes out, etc. So it is kind of interesting. And then also on top of that, it's like, what parts of experiment design do we want to be automated versus do we want to be subjective, right? For something like flow cytometry, like that's a great example where it's like, yeah, like probably shouldn't be a manual process, and there's like, and small errors can result in like catastrophes, right? Especially in something like CAR-T. But in other areas, like maybe actually scientists, don't want to be taken out of the process for that part of the experiment design, for example. So it'll be interesting to see the evolution, I think, of how scientists get involved in experiment design in the future.
And by the way, I think it is what needs to happen, right? Because we see it in our own business where our applications just speak to the end user scientist, and that's all we think about. And, not that we don't think about the enterprise, but ultimately the scientists or the users of these applications, it works really, really well. But what happens is the enterprise needs all this data. That is their moat. That is going to be their moat, right, in this future. And so you have to capture all that data. So to the extent that folks can work on the problem of pushing as much work as possible to the innovators and the people that actually understand and have the insights, that would be great, right? And I think that is probably where we're headed. And don't want to say it. Maybe these are not the right terms to use, but if there is a low code, no code way for scientists to model and aggregate and correlate all of their data with an infrastructure underneath that is just kind of they can't see it, but that's okay. That's where we're headed, right? And ultimately, it's all in the cloud. Ultimately, it has to be at infinite scale. And so you need these horizontal infrastructure players. It is what has enabled it, right? Like we are there now. It has enabled the technology, I think, has made it to the point where these things are possible. Getting the user experience exactly correct around how that would work is where there just needs to be a lot more work and innovation taking place.
All I'm going to say is if Accenture ends up being the beneficiary of the AI boom, I'm going to quit this industry. So, I'm just kidding.
No comment. But that is what happens today, right? Like it's complicated, right? And so it makes sense, right? It makes sense.
One thing I'm curious about, with the tools that you built, you mentioned it kind of way earlier on that, they're not just relevant for life sciences. Obviously, there's a lot of stuff happening in the R&D space. Maybe help us think through, there's so many companies that start building for life sciences, and I think in some hypothetical future, they're like, well, we could go into some other spaces. Like, are those spaces interesting enough relative to life sciences? Like, how do you think about where those are headed and opportunities for companies in them?
We do think they're interesting enough, and we think the use case and the software that enables it is very similar, right? And so chemicals and materials businesses today aren't that dissimilar, whether you're creating paint or rubber tires or, new material. It's not that dissimilar from small molecule experimentation that happens. And so we think about the chemicals and material space. We have customers in the chemicals and material space. We want to keep innovating it. Food and beverage space as well, right? You think about meats, sustainable meats. It's still science is doing this type of work, right? And the work is abstracted away enough that the end use case is very different. But we think about it. We think there's opportunities to do it. I know other people think that there's things are too dissimilar to do that, and you need to actually pick. It's not what we believe. We believe you can actually serve both constituents very, very well. I will say the margin profile of those customers, though, to their end users looks very, very different, right? So chemicals and materials businesses, when you look at the end user and the margin profile looks very different than if you find a new drug, right? And so the investment that takes, the growth in the markets look very different, but we think you can serve both spaces incredibly well. And not to say we do it phenomenally well today, but we do it today. We're going to continue to do that.
Listen, all I'm going to say is you find more people trying to get into life sciences from outside of life sciences than the other way around.
You do. And by the way, my guess is that will be the case for several years, many, if not decades, right? No doubt about it. No doubt about it.
Drugs are not going away. So I have a question. You talked a little bit earlier about kind of your inorganic acquisition strategy. You're buying up tools to bring them in. I'm curious, how do you think about what areas you want to do your acquisition next? And then two, is this primarily for customers are asking for like a specific tool or feature that you don't have and you go out to buy one? Or is it like, hey, there's a whole customer set that we are not targeted and we need to buy kind of that book of business and we're going to use this as a wedge? Like, what's the strategy as you think about the inorganic acquisition sort of play?
Yeah, a great question. So most of the ideas come from our customers. And you know what they say is, here's 50 other people that I'm spending money on. I can't get them to do X, Y, and Z, which I really need. Can you see if you can buy them? Because I really need help in trying to integrate it to my ecosystem, right? So most of the opportunities come from our customers. And the use case is just simply that is what we kind of talked about. It's, I need all of these things to play nice in the sandbox together. And I think if you guys, Dotmatics, can own more things in the sandbox that I care about, I can align towards that, because there's a few things that absolutely have happened here with every acquisition that we've made. And one is we're able to increase the amount of product and technology spending that takes place across all of our products. So for the most part, all of them normally are the champion brand or the challenger brand in their swim lane. But we invest more in product and technology. And by the way, we do that because you do have economies of scale. You are more efficient in your go-to-market activities, your S&M, your G&A activities. And so we're able to do that and keep innovating, because that's what people need and want, right? And again, we talked a little bit about the instrument companies, but you know, when an instrument company today buys a software company, I don't think there's anybody in the ecosystem that goes, oh, in 5 years, this software is going to be so much better than it is today, right? Like, nobody does that. But the converse is true, because history has shown the path there. We don't do that. We know that if we're going to be instrument agnostic and we're going to keep innovating, you have to put more dollars into R&D. And we're able to do that. Now, the hard part, Nikhil, is founders of these businesses, because most of these businesses have never raised capital, or if they have, it's a small amount of capital. You need to share your vision of the ecosystem with customers, or with the potential acquisition targets. But I think of the way that we think about it, and what we've been told is, you need scale to be transformative, right? You need scale to impact the world. And we provide scale, and we provide it in a way that is instrument agnostic for software providers. And I think that is one where people want to be a part of what we're doing, and they've seen what we're doing. They've seen how we've run the businesses after the fact. By the way, it doesn't mean that you could still make the math work. Obviously, expectations of value and reality of value might be different. But that, to your point, it's come from our customers, right? Our customers normally are the ones. And if you think about the space today, we have well over 1,000 companies on our target list. Software, by the way, 1,000 software companies on our target list. We talk to tens, if not 20, 30 companies a month. We continue to look at the space. So there is a long runway of companies that'll exist and continue to exist in this ecosystem, just again, because the complexity of the swim lanes and science that exists today. And so we think about that inorganic growth. Obviously, the business grows organically. We continue to add organically, and there's plenty of runway. And today we're just talking about R&D. We do have one company today that exists in clinical trials. It's a product called Inquiry, and it's around kind of running adaptive clinical trials and doing Bayesian statistics around that space. And again, it's a similar space. It's the one thing that we own that isn't in R&D today. But there are obviously, you move out of R&D, you move into preclinical, you move into clinical. There are software companies in all up and down that ecosystem. And so as we think about TAM expansion into the future, there's just plenty of opportunities to continue to move forward.
Yeah, let me get that list of 1,000 companies when you get a sec.
That's right. Well, you know what's funny? You probably know this. A lot of investors get a hold of us and they say, "Well, let me throw some M&A ideas your way." And I said, "Boy, if you guys have M&A ideas that we haven't covered, because we work really hard at this, right? We work really hard at this, and our customers tell us, quite frankly, right? They share the data with us." So,
well, I'll do another shameless investor thing, which is to say, obviously, the thousands of companies that are out there. You have a ton of these products yourself, like. There must be some areas where you wish there was a product, but there isn't anything yet. Like, as you think about, we have a lot of entrepreneurs or potential entrepreneurs that listen to this podcast. Like, what are some areas on the R&D side where you're not seeing folks build things that you feel like could be particularly, impactful?
We haven't bought anything in the multi-omics space, right? That's a big space. We haven't bought a product in the single cell space. We don't have an image analysis product, a digital pathology product. So there are these swim lanes that we continue to look at and continue to think about that our customers are saying, "Hey, please do this." But again, it's under the guise of we need everything to come together in a way that's cost efficient. And so we think Dotmatics can help make that happen because that is what we're trying to do, right? And sometimes they'll point the finger at me. I will talk about the data silos that exist, and they're like, "Well, remember, some of the products you own are the reason the data silos exist, right? Because Prism doesn't allow things to, historically over the past 20 years, that wasn't how the business prioritized doing things, right? And so it's a lot of the things that we own today that have created these silos. And so now it's our job to break them down, break them apart, and make them interoperable. But we're doing that, and it's going to happen, right? We're going to make that happen.
It's everything comes back to that one XKCD comic where it's like, we need to have one standard or one thing to rule all of the thing, to make everything interoperable, and that's how the next standard was, the 15th standard was created.
But that's a great point, Nikhil. Like, standards in this space just haven't stuck, right? And there are consortiums of people and pharma companies have got together and let's have a 25,000 table universal data model that we all agree. Like, it just hasn't worked. It goes really, really quickly. And, like I said, because the instruments get better too, you might have something that works today and in 3 months, all of a sudden, none of your data models work because there's more data coming off. So now who's going to go create those tables, and how does that work, and how do we correlate that data? So, part of the complexity exists today, but it's the opportunity because I will say, and I think we all agree, there are so much benefit to humanity as a whole if you can just drive costs down tremendously, right? Whether it's drug pricing, whether it's targeting rare diseases that never before there was a business model to go target rare diseases. But if you can drop the cost dramatically, you can actually go solve some of these problems today that there just wasn't a really good business case around. I just think it's just endless, right? And I get excited when I talk about it because, like, when you think about it, it's like the work you do, the work we do matters, right? It matters a lot. And yes, it's hard and we struggle internally, our customers struggle, but boy, what a great way to wake up and spend your day, right? Trying to solve some of these challenges. And if you love hard problems, like, this is it. This is a hard one, right? This is a hard one.
Well, Thomas, this has been a fascinating conversation. I'm sure folks will want to pick up on lots of different threads of what we discussed. What's the best way for them to find out more about you and Dotmatics?
Yeah, I would just go to dotmatics.com, right? We have all of our information there. All of our products are there and things about the business. And if you're listening to this podcast, you have a software product that serves the constituents we've talked about today. We are always looking for more acquisitions and more ways to add value. So please reach out to me on LinkedIn or get a hold of us here. So.
Have you considered acquiring a newsletter or a podcast for into the fold?
Yes, I have. That's exactly right. Exactly right.